Good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation around conflict and perhaps how to shift from a position of being engaged in what we might feel is a polarizing conflict into maybe a meaningful connection. Might sound impossible. When you think of conflict, you might think of arguing and fighting and taking sides. You might think of intense feelings and digging your heels in and wanting to win, right? So how do we take all of that when we're engaged in a conflict and transform that into something that actually brings us together as a team or gives us a sense of connection? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to touch on 5 strategies or tips that I have been taught from the children that I work with. They've been really good about giving me chances time and time again. When I get it wrong, the problem solving that we do, they just come back with another opportunity for me to work on my own skills of problem solving with them or with their teachers. I've also gotten some of my training from some really amazing women at the Dartmouth Trauma Research Center here in New Hampshire. They gave me some really good training on the brain, trauma, how the brain reacts when it feels stressed, this fight or flight or flock tendency that we have, and how to kind of manage that and get through that in a way that's productive, so that we don't feel like a conflict is actually Tyrannosaurus Rex coming to eat us and kill us. A conflict is just a disagreement, and we have to find a way to discover common ground through that conflict and move on together. So the 5 parts that I'm going to talk about are soften, reflective statements, joining statements, common ground, and collaborative statements. And then the last one, number 5, is choices. So why do I start with soften? And what do I mean by soften? Am I softening bread dough? What am I softening when I talk about that? What I'm talking about is this phenomenon of facial expression, body language, all of these sort of vibes that we give off whenever we're interacting with somebody else. Our facial expression will show a completely different look when we are approaching someone that we haven't seen in a long time, that we care for a lot, and we're so happy to see them. It'll look a lot different than when we see somebody that we're angry at, or we have a hard time with, or we don't have confidence that they see us for who we are, or that they see the work that we do in its true form, our efforts. So this body language makes up 65% of communication. It's amazing, actually. It's packed with energy, and it can really set the tone for the hard work that needs to happen when we're trying to manage a conflict or work through a conflict. Feelings can come through our facial expression. I know that you can have eyes that just look angry all the time. I have to make an effort. I have those eyes, actually, and I have to make an effort to raise my eyebrows when I speak to people, because my natural face is, it's intrusive and it's put-offing or off-putting. And it has nothing to do with how I'm actually feeling. It just has to do with the look of my face and my eyes. And so I've learned from feedback that I need to adjust or make a conscious effort to make my face kind of have a more welcoming look to it. It's not a problem. I appreciate the feedback. So that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about, are our arms crossed? Are our ears open? Or are we giving off this sense of closedness, like we've already decided the outcome of the conversation to come, and we're defensive and protective about it? That's what we're talking about. So when I use the word soften, I'm talking about being aware of how you might be coming across in your body language as you approach the situation of needing to resolve a conflict with somebody, that uncomfortableness. Are you wearing that discomfort on your face? Is that discomfort coming through with your eyes or your arms? And can you do something about that before the words even flow? And of course you can. But sometimes we don't know to do anything about that until we're aware of it. And so I would invite you, as the first step to working through a conflict with somebody, when you meet with them and you're sitting across the table from them, that you take a few moments to just do some deep breathing and sort of an internal assessment of, what's my body language saying right now? What's my goal for this conversation? Am I open to listening? Am I just wanting to be heard? Or is it going to be a combination of the two of those things together? After we, can sort of take care of our body language, we want to then really focus on sort of a reflective position, a reflective statement. And it's not very often that we might find ourselves in a situation of resolving a conflict where only one person is worried about the conversation that's to come. Usually both people are kind of worried about the conversation because conflict is uncomfortable. It's a little bit of tension, it's a little bit of ill ease. It's just hard. And that's why, when we can just kind of take a step back and observe the process instead of the content of the process, then the content gets much smaller. The content, the heated issue, what caused the conflict, becomes much smaller because the surrounding pieces of the conflict, we work those out before we even get into the conflict, and then we are presenting ourselves with this calmer, sort of joined mission. So when we're doing reflective statements, we're going to be looking at the other person, and we're going to be thinking about what state they're in. And I bring up right now the mirror neurons. The mirror neurons are these wonderful things in our brains that teach us new skills without really any effort. They take on what they see from somebody else and they integrate it into our brains. And then when we make the motions of what we've just seen, sometimes we can just magically do it. So that's kind of like what when we watch, we do, right? So we watch somebody pick up a baseball bat and we watch them swing. So we pick up a baseball bat and we do the same motion. And the process that has happened right then and there is through our mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are also what make feelings catchy. So when we're sitting across from somebody and we're trying to work through a conflict or work through a tense moment, we have to be careful because our mirror neurons are looking to that person's feeling state and absorbing it and making us have to decide, are we going to take that on for ourselves, or are we going to be able to kind of hold it in between us and just kind of notice it? So when we're reflecting, we're kind of holding it in between us and noticing it. When we're letting the feeling state be catchy, our mirror neurons are kind of doing their thing, and the next thing we know, we're grumpy, and we don't even know why we're grumpy. So we have some power there, right? We have some power when we're in a state of reflecting, that we can notice how somebody else looks, and we can give some idea about what they might be feeling, and we can just notice it, and we can wonder about it, and we can comment about it, and we might be wrong, right? But if we notice about it, and we comment about it, and we ask about it, it's so powerful because, one, we're showing respect, that we're interested in learning about how the other person is feeling or their thoughts, so that we don't make any assumptions or bring our own stuff into it. That's really important, right? So we ask about it and we say, I can kind of notice on your face that maybe, you got some feelings about this conversation we have to have. I know I do. And I'm wondering if we can just kind of talk about that before we get into the meat of it, right? Or, I notice that your hands are clenched and that your foot is going up and down really fast. And I'm wondering if you're uncomfortable with the fact that we have to have this conversation. Let's talk about that. Can we talk about that? Right? So you keep it in the middle and it becomes something that you guys can talk about together. And actually that's called name it to tame it. And that's a really good skill. But reflecting back what you're seeing is really important. It keeps the feeling state from being catchy so that you don't have two people that are upset or worried or anxious when you're trying to do this conflict resolution. So after we do that, and we kind of spend some time going back and forth with reflective statements, right? Then we have a sense of what we're each bringing to the table. And hopefully through the reflective statements, and it's trial and error, right? And it's done respectfully, then you have a nice starting point. You have a nice starting point to go ahead and talk about the conflict. Now, conflict, as I said before, implies that two people are on different sides of a fence, and they're looking at each other from very different perspectives. So the next part of this would be joining statements, and that invites the participants to consider what they have in common with this conflict, right? And again, we're not maybe at the heart of the conflict yet, but we're one step closer than we were when we were talking around the conflict about the feeling states that we're bringing to the process of talking about the conflict. So now we might be talking about like we're at the edge of the conflict. And we might say something like, I really don't like it when I have to have these conversations with people. I just am so nervous about it, and I just never know how it's going to end. And I worry that talking about a conflict might make it worse than better. More worse than better. Do you ever feel like that? And as soon as you're asking, do you feel like that ever, you're inviting a joining statement. You're inviting someone to find common ground with you around this process of conflict. And they might say, yeah, no, I'm good because I know I'm right. They might say that, Or they might say, oh, yeah, I know exactly where you're coming from. It's hard, and I worry too. Or it's just hard, right? And that's the joining statement. You have now found some common ground. And then you build on that, right? You're just going to build on that joining statement. And the beauty of a joining statement is that nobody feels like they're in it alone. You might be sitting across the table from each other, one person in one spot and one person in another, But once you do the joining statements and you find the common ground, now there's a sense of togetherness. And you want to then expand that togetherness into how do we together solve this problem? We might still have a different perspective about the problem or about the conflict, but we're closer about how we see the problem. So we might make more joining statements like, I don't know what we might say. We might say something like what our goals are. Well, I just really hope, you might bring up a goal from the other side of the conflict, a hope, and you might say, I just really hope that when this is all said and done, we're still friends. Because I don't want a conflict to jeopardize a friendship, right? I want to figure out a way where we can disagree and still be friends. And so now you're on one side of the conflict when you're talking about the beginning joining statement, and now you've introduced another joining statement on the other side of the conflict. And then all that's left is building the bridge in between, right? So joining statements are really good, and we can do them in two different ways. We can say a joining statement like, I feel that way too, and here's when I felt it. Or, like, I feel anxious too when I talk about conflicts. When I had to do X, Y, and Z with this person, I felt so anxious. That's one way of joining. You're joining through experiences that you think are similar to what each other has had that lead to the same feeling, and you are focusing on the experiences and the feelings. The other way to join is to do sort of empathetic listening, which is to not bring yourself into it in terms of your conversation, but to really just say, oh, yeah, that must have really made you feel anxious. Because you're looking inside of yourself when you hear that person talking about their experience. You're thinking about when you might have had a similar experience, but you are in touch with the feeling that you had, and you're lining that feeling up with whether or not you're thinking that person is having that same feeling. So then you're joining in the feeling without having to ask that person to sort of stop expressing what they're experiencing to look at you. It's a constant focus on them and checking out that you are making sure you're truly seeing the issue from their perspective. And as we do that, we can bring that into the heart of the conflict, right? So when you have this joining mentality going on, then you can start to talk about the conflict. And you can talk about it from two different perspectives, and you can reach the middle to find common ground, or you can just keep asking questions. I'm not sure I really understand where you're coming from with this. Can you help me understand this? And the person can talk to you about where their heels are really dug in the conversation, right? Because it goes back to a really strong value inside of them. The conflict has some connection to a value inside of them that is probably closely connected to their sense of personal integrity. So the conflict represents having to give up my personal integrity or something in my value system, and I'm not prepared to do that. Now, chances are, the purpose of the conflict is not to have the person give up a value or to, compromise their integrity. The conflict is probably just about the conflict. So by exploring that and asking questions about that, being curious about that, you're inviting the person to kind of look at it and explore it with you and trust you, right? To trust this vulnerability with you. And when they feel like you have a really good sense of where they're coming from, it doesn't mean that you agree with them. It just means that you're connected and standing beside them, looking at the conflict from their perspective. And once they feel heard and they feel respected and they feel connected and they understand that you're connected to how they see the conflict, you have now role modeled for them that they can go ahead and do that for you. And you can check in. Is it okay if I show you my perspective of this conflict? Right? And then you can start to talk about the meaningfulness of the conflict for you. And maybe they will start to ask you some exploratory questions about that and be curious about it. And now, once you have done that, right, because you're doing this in a respectful and meaningful way with a common goal of working through the conflict has lost its power. Because the value of the relationship, the integrity of the relationship, keeps each of you connected to your value systems and sense of integrity of how you carry yourselves. And the conflict has lost the power to bring you away from those values. The way we act in a conflict when we're angry, that's what takes us away from our personal value system or our personal integrity. But the way you're handling the conflict now, respectfully and listening, the conflict has lost its power and it's safe to talk about because it's just this third thing out there that you guys want to figure out. So as you do that joining conversation back and forth, that exploratory conversation, you feel the sense of we're in it together. And you might even not know how you got there or when it happens, but all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I get it. I know what you mean. Oh man, yeah, I just hadn't thought of that before. Oh, I see why you reacted that way because you were looking at it from this perspective, right? And none of that is threatening. Our heels are coming up out of the ground and we're able to walk closer to somebody else's perspective without the fear of losing our value system and our integrity. So once we get that past that point, we're just going to move into collaborative statements, right? The working together. And actually, we've already kind of moved into that through the joining statements and what we've already talked about. We're going to move into the collaborative statements like, so what are we going to do about this? How are we going to work together to not let this happen again? And how can we come up with some solutions that meet both of our needs? And it's way simpler at this point than it was in the beginning. And the reason, and I'm just going to stress it again, the reason is because the value and the integrity is in place instead of being displaced in the intensity of the conflict. That the value and the integrity has returned to your inner selves and in between yourselves. And that is where it belongs. The conflict can represent your value system and your integrity. But the way you handle that conflict is what takes you away from that if you handle it poorly. So this process just gives you a way to handle the conflict in a way that gets you back in touch with your own value system and your own personal sense of integrity of how you carry yourself. And that feels good, frankly. All right, so once we get through the collaborative statements, right, we come up with some choices. And we just say, well, what if we tried this? Or what if we tried that? And because you're already in this process of sharing ideas and being reflective and your defenses are lower, you might be open to choices now that you might not have been open before. Maybe you understand the choices better or more fully because you're looking at them from both perspectives, not just your own. So, I hope this was helpful. This is what I wanted to present today. And I invite you to try these 5 pieces, these 5 strategies when you're finding yourself in a tense or uncomfortable situation with somebody else. It might not be labeled as a conflict, but you know what I'm talking about. Anytime you pick up some stress or tension between you and somebody else, how are you going to approach that? How are you going to work through that and get back to this comfortable place within a relationship? That's what the hope is. So I wanted to present this today, and then I actually got through everything today instead of breaking it up. And so I'm going to let this sit for a while on YouTube, and hopefully you guys take a look at it and listen, and give me some comments and some feedback. Then the second part that I will do on Wednesday is how to apply this with your children, or children in general, or other people. It'll be a more specific 5-step process of going from like heated tension and like a wall of no into some pretty concrete problem solving steps that lead to some confidence about how to get through some difficult times that are stemmed from just big emotions that take us away from our own value system sometimes, because they guide our behavior and our choices instead of our value systems. So I hope this is helpful. Please reach out. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will try to do a recording that answers them as well. Or I'll just answer them on Humble. And before I head out, I want to make sure I give credit to Dan Siegel for the name it to tame it concept of naming your heated issue, putting it out there, because that already makes it less intense. And then also credit to the Dartmouth Trauma Research Center here in New Hampshire, Dr. Erin Barnett and Cassie Yackley, for all of their training that they have provided me over the years. Thank you.